Nicole, the presentation is yours. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. I am very excited to be here. I'm excited that you all are joining me virtually for this session. This is one of my absolute favorite things to teach to students and to new coaches. Policy debate is my favorite event, but don't tell my students. And I really enjoy introducing it to new people. I will tell you that I also tell my students whenever I start teaching policy debate that I think teaching or learning this event is like learning a new language. There is an incredible amount of vocabulary to know when you're learning policy or CX debate. And so it can sometimes be really overwhelming because just like learning a new language, you're going to learn all of these new terms that relate to CX debate. And you will, I promise, eventually get to a point where those terms you just automatically register in your mind as to what they mean. But it can be really overwhelming at first to kind of try to keep going back and remember what all of those different terms mean. So I encourage you, just as I encourage my students, to stick with it, and it will all eventually just come naturally to you. So we'll start just kind of with what policy debate, what CX debate is. I think it's important first and foremost to talk about debate as a game, because it is. Sometimes, we get lost in the seriousness of the issues that the students are debating, because certainly they are debating issues that are really profoundly important. But at the center, it is a game, and it's important that students have fun and that they want to win. That's a good thing. Wanting to win is a good thing, but that they also make sure that they are having fun. So when we talk about argumentation in debate, it's important, I think, to always start with what the basic part of an argument is, because that's sort of the foundation. Before we can learn anything else about CX debate, we have to learn what just a good argument looks like. So the first part of a good argument is just the claim, and the claim can be anything. So the claim, I always start my students with something really simple. The claim can be anything like dogs are better pets than cats. And I try to start them really with very simple things like that. Dr. Pepper is better than Coke. Those sort of very simple claims, and they're just that, an assertion. But it's important that students learn the next step. So when they assert something, when they make a claim, the next step of that argument is to provide what we call a warrant. And that's just a reason why. So I tell my students when we're learning claim and warrant, once they've made their statements, they have to ask themselves in their head, why is that true? So Dr. Pepper is better than Coke. They need a reason why that's true. So Dr. Pepper is better than Coke because it has a variety of more flavors in just that one drink. So that's a reason, why their argument is true. But if every time they make an assertion, they'll ask themselves that question, why, and make sure that they provide that statement in a debate round. And then the last part of an argument is the impact. So that's the reason why the argument is important. So in some of the silly examples, that may be a little bit harder, right? We're going to have to find an impact to why it's important to talk about Dr. Pepper being better than Coke. But we want to make sure that we're teaching students that there has to be an importance to their argument, because especially when we're just starting out in those beginning debate rounds, sometimes kids will get really, really caught up in they have found one thing that the other team is wrong about it, and they want to make sure that everyone knows. And they're going to make their claim, and they're going to make their warrants, but then when it comes down to it, that thing that the other team was wrong about didn't have any kind of impact. Right? It wasn't really important to the overall round. And so then kids will come out sometimes kind of frustrated, like, I don't understand why. I pointed out that this thing was wrong. I provided a reason why, but did it matter to the overall debate round that they were wrong about that particular thing? So every single argument that our students make should have those three things: a claim, warrant, and an impact. So I left this on here. We're obviously not going to do this together, but I wanted you to see this is an actual refutation practice that I do with my students. So I wanted you to see that so that you can kind of have an idea of what I do in class. So they literally write down a claim, cats are better than dogs, and they have to provide 3 warrants. And then they have to learn how to refute those things. And so this helps them get past cats are better than dogs and the argument against that being no, they're not, right? It helps them see, okay, they've got to talk about each of these 3 warrants. They've got to explain why these 3 warrants are wrong. So I scaffold this in my classroom. So I told you I do something very simple like this: cats are better than dogs, or some years I'll try to make it relevant to maybe something in pop culture that the kids are interested in. And then I scaffold this refutation practice to be more and more difficult topics. So we'll go from something kind of silly like this to maybe something that's happening on the news that I know the kids, even if they don't watch the news very well, that I know the kids will have heard about. And then we try to scaffold that up to something that relates to the actual debate topic that we're talking about. That way the kids get their feet wet with something that's really simple. And I show them these steps. So when they refute an argument, it's important to start with, they say, cats are better than dogs, but I disagree because, and when we start, we do sound very formulaic. This isn't how I would want them to sound in a debate round, but I think to get into the rhythm of what all has to be required when they're making an argument, I do think it's important for them to have this formula. And so when we're just learning, this really is how the kids sound in my classroom. They say cats are better than dogs, but I disagree because. Hopefully they don't sound like that, by the time they're seniors and debating at larger tournaments, but they do need to start this way because I think it's an important scaffold for them. So policy debate, or CX debate, as distinct from the other types of debate, is a civilized argument to decide which policy option should be adopted. So other types of debate may be debating about kind of broader concepts like value-based concept or moral-based concept. And policy debate is really talking about an actual particular policy that could be passed and discussing whether or not that policy should be. So the topics generally begin with the United States federal government should, and it's a discussion about whether or not our federal government should pass a particular policy or not. So just like any game, there are 2 sides. So in a debate round, there are 2 options. So this is where some of the terminology comes in. It'd be maybe nice if debaters just called it like you were for the topic or you were not for the topic, but we can't do that. So in the debate world, we have an affirmative and a negative. So the affirmative team is obviously arguing that the United States federal government should in fact pass whatever policy. And the important part for an affirmative team is to have a plan for how the federal government is going to pass that particular policy. So for this year's topic, an affirmative team can't just say the United States federal government should reform the criminal justice system. It's the burden of the affirmative team to define how the federal government would do that. And so that affirmative position becomes what we call the 1AC plan text. So 1AC stands for first affirmative constructive. And the plan text is literally that. At some point in that first affirmative speech, the affirmative team will read their plan text. They will read exactly how they plan to reform the criminal justice system. The negative team, just by default, they're defending, and they have some options, and we'll talk about that later, but by default, the negative team is defending the status quo. So the negative team is saying, no, we should not reform the criminal justice system. We should not do your plan. We should just do what we're doing now. We should keep things the way they are. So let's talk about that 1AC again. So remember, 1AC is first affirmative constructive. So it's the first affirmative speech that happens. We call it a constructive because it's exactly that. It's the first time that the affirmative team is building their case and constructing their original sets of arguments. So the first thing that they need in an affirmative case is a reason why we need to change the status quo in the first place. Because the negative team is going to be saying, let's just keep doing what we're doing. So the affirmative team's got to have a reason. If we're going to do this, we got to have a why. There's got to be some sort of advantage to voting affirmative. We can't just say, well, here's a plan. I don't know if it'll affect anything. I don't know if it'll change anything, or even if it should, here's just a plan. There's got to be something that is advantageous, some reason why the judge should vote to change something in the status quo. And so those things, those reasons why we should change the status quo are sometimes called advantages and sometimes called harms. You'll see them kind of two different ways in affirmative cases. When I debated in high school, I think pretty much holistically they were called harms. And the more and more rounds I judge, I'm hearing that term advantages in place of harms a little bit more and more. But it's at least worth noting that sometimes they're used interchangeably. So this is kind of the story about why the policy option is good. So the harms and the advantages, a lot of times we'll talk about, here are the bad things that are happening in the status quo. So for criminal justice reform, they're going to talk about, here are the faults in our criminal justice system, and here are the bad things that are created from those faults in our criminal justice system. This is a really important piece for the affirmative team because this is their big offense. This is their big reason why their AF is really, really important. And so it's a very critical piece of their first affirmative constructive that they talk about why their plan matters so much. I will tell you that a big kind of joke probably for people when they're talking about policy debaters and CX debaters is that we think that everything will lead to nuclear war. Well, I don't think that's true that I really think that, but that is true, that part of the name of the game in CX debate is trying to discuss these really major impacts that could possibly happen because of a lack of reform in the criminal justice system or whatever the policy topic is at the time. And I'll tell you so I recently, when my husband and I met, we were both debaters. So you can imagine arguments in our house. So we're both debaters. And so I was watching him debate one time when we were in school, and he had this argument. And I thought, like, after the round, I told him, that's ridiculous. That impact is never going to happen, Andrew. I can't believe that you won that round. Well, listen, it is. Like, it is happening. It was about virus mutations. And he read this article recently about virus mutations, and he showed it to me, and he was like, see, it is happening. So we do talk about really, really big impacts in policy debate in particular. And so some of that is important, though. It is important that we try to maximize the reason why the judge should vote for the affirmative team. And so I talked to the teams about, we want to make sure that there's always a story. So while sometimes LDers like to pick on the CX kids for our nuclear war impacts. It is important that our kids are not making arguments like, the federal government is spending too much money, consequently we're all going to die because of nuclear war. We want to make sure that there's some linkage to those arguments. We don't want them to just jump from one thing to the next, but we do want them to find as many impacts as they can find the links for. And all of that is part of the harms and advantages part. There are different types of impacts that we can talk about. And so I think that causal and war impacts a lot of times are easier for kids to grasp. They're really tangible. This particular policy could lead to a conflict with a particular country. That war would be bad. Those sort of causal impacts are tangible and easy for kids to get. I think, however, for the criminal justice reform topic, what you're going to be seeing more of are moral obligation impacts and systemic impacts. So you're going to hear people not necessarily talking about probably nuclear war and those sorts of things as much. You're going to see them talk about systemic racism. You're going to see them talk about the ethics of decisions that are made, probably particularly on disenfranchised populations. And so you want to have those conversations with kids because those things still are important. Moral obligation and systemic impacts are still really important. It can be easy for people new to debate to say, like, but nuclear war is definitely bigger. So you want to actually help students, though, kind of flesh out that argument because those things are hard to interact with each other. Like these nuclear war impacts, those are really big and those are really tangible, but also probably really big impacts are still these kind of ethical decisions. So you want to kind of help students figure out how those interact with each other. So I tell my students that they should be a storyteller. One of my students several years ago took that and said, he would use the phrase, we've got to sell the car. And so that's what we would talk about when he was speaking on the affirmative team. He would say, you're right, I've got to sell the car better. I've got to tell the story. And so I want students, I try to get them to practice these phrases. Voting affirmative prevents this terrible thing from happening. Voting affirmative helps to end systemic racism. Voting affirmative prevents nuclear war with India and Pakistan. Or even on the flip side, voting negative allows the US government to spend too much money. That hurts the economy. Those sorts of things, those sorts of phrases are important. I think even for my senior debaters, because even for me as a judge in the back of the room, that's what I would like. I would like someone to spell it out to me that clearly. Voting affirmative does this, or voting negative does that. All right, so we have advantages. We've got harms. We're still in the first affirmative constructive. So in a case is inherency. So what that means is that you have got to prove in your affirmative case that the plan is the plan that you want to pass, the 1AC plan text. You've got to prove that it's not already happening and that there's some kind of, at least somewhat of a reason that it's not happening. Some people get kind of caught up on that. I don't think it has to be as complicated. I think that at the crux of it, though, you can't pass a policy that the federal government's already doing, because in that case, the debate round shouldn't really happen, right? And you really probably, even if that reason that it's not passing has something to do with politics, some reason it's not making it through the House, some reason it's not making it through the Senate. But I think that if you don't have something like that, you're going to run into arguments where people say, well, if your plan is so great, why would the federal government not have already passed it? So you want to be able to kind of answer those questions, and that's an inherency. Inherency is also going to be the smallest part of your student's first affirmative constructive. So as a general, obviously everything's a little different, but as a general rule of thumb, my students cut just one piece of evidence for their inherency. And that's pretty standard, I would say, for the rounds that I judge. So we've got advantages. We know that what's happening right now, what policies are not being implemented. So now we need what our policy is going to be. So whereas the rest of the first affirmative constructive is going to be lots of evidence, lots of things that your students are reading, but were written by other people, the plan is a few sentences that your students are writing. So a couple of things to be wary of when you're doing that is when you put it in the plan, you have to defend it. So whatever is in there, you're defending, and it is very important that you are specific in the plan text, but also concise. You do not want to add a whole bunch of things that you're not prepared to actually defend. So it's important that you include in the plan text only what you need to, only what you have to, and that you are as specific as you can and want to be. Just remember, the more specific you get, now you're defending all of those things. So you want to be clear, but you want to keep in mind every time you get more and more specific, those are more and more things that you have to defend. All right, so we're going to have this problem that's happening in the status quo. We know that it's not being solved because we read inherency. We've read what our plan is to solve this problem, to fix it. Now we've got to read some evidence that says that that actually works and that it actually will solve the problem. We can't assume that it just solves the problem because we say so. So we've got to read some evidence that says that the problem will actually be solved. This is a really important part of the affirmative case as well, because remember, your plan text, like what's in your plan text needs to match what's being written by your solvency authors. Because if your plan text says something that doesn't quite match up with what's in this evidence, well, then this evidence isn't really talking about your plan. So I actually have my students write the plan last. We go and find solvency evidence first, and then we use that evidence to help inform the way that we write the plan text. Because otherwise, we're coming up with a solution that we may not actually be able to find any evidence that says that that works. And so we start with the research part, and then we formulate that plan last. I teach my students now that the order of the affirmative case should be whatever makes the most sense. I will say as well, though, that when I was in high school, we wrote our affirmatives in a very specific order. And I think that you will still find coaches that I highly respect that have valuable reasons why they think the affirmative case should be in a specific order. So know that people kind of have different philosophies there. This is just what I tell my students. So I tell them it's whatever makes the most sense to tell a story that someone can kind of follow. Generally speaking, whenever I judge rounds, I'm seeing this order most often, where there's inherency, plan text, advantages/harms, and then solvency. So different than what I debated, to be honest, 14 years ago or whatever that was. But that's the order that I see now most often. The first affirmative constructive is 8 minutes long. So students have, and that sounds and feels like a lot when you're starting out, and by the time you've been in this a while and your students are seniors, 8 minutes is not long enough. They feel like they need more time, but they get 8 minutes. I think that I find myself writing on ballots often if the first affirmative is not at least coming close to the 7.5, 7:30 mark, I find myself writing on ballots, hey, I think you could put more arguments in. I think it might be a little short. So if that kind of gives you an idea, it cannot be longer than 8 minutes. So there's no extra time at 8 minutes. They have to stop no matter what. And this is their 8 minutes to advocate for their position. And so I tell, sometimes what happens a lot, especially with new debaters, is they spend 8 minutes reading this first affirmative constructive, and then you never hear about those arguments at any other point in the debate round. So I remind my students from the beginning, don't lose it. Don't leave it way back there in the first speech and never talk about it again. I think that in every single speech, students should be reminding the judge about the problem that they say exists, the way that they think that they can solve it, and that they have evidence that says they can solve it. So here's kind of what a debate round looks like. There are 3 types of speeches in policy debate. There's a constructive, rebuttal, and cross-examination periods. Constructives are all 8 minutes. Rebuttals are always 5. Cross-examinations are always 3. There are 2 people on each CX team, and everyone is going to get at least one of these. So all 4 people in the room, everyone on each team, is going to get a constructive and a rebuttal. And in cross-examination, there's going to be a time for everyone to answer questions, and then there's going to be a different time for everyone to ask questions. So you can already probably sense that CX debate is a little long, and it is a little bit long. And I remember thinking when I was first doing CX debate, oh my goodness, it's usually about an hour and a half, and I remember thinking, this is going to last forever. And now, even when I'm judging rounds, they seem to just go by incredibly quickly. Prep time is an amount of time that both teams get. They get 8 minutes. They can use that 8 minutes roughly however they want. They can't use it in the middle of anyone's speeches, but in between speeches, they can use that 8 minutes, but it's important to know they get 8 minutes total to be used for the entire round, and they get 8 minutes per team, not 8 minutes per person. So when I judge novice rounds, there seems to be a lot of prep time confusion, and sometimes kids will run out of prep time when they didn't know that they ran out of prep time. So you get 8 minutes per team, and that's just total. All right, so when you put it all together, here's what the debate round looks like. So all of the A's are affirmative, the N's are negative, the C's are constructives, the R's are rebuttals. So you'll see there are 4 constructives to start. So each person on the team gets an opportunity to build and construct their arguments. And then it ends with 4 rebuttals. So everyone on the team gets an opportunity to refute the arguments being made in the round. By the time you get here to these 4 rebuttals at the end, no arguments here and these rebuttals. This is a time to take all of the arguments that have already been made and try to compare them and flesh out for the judge why you should win the debate. During those 4 constructives, you'll notice that in between each one, they have to answer questions for 3 minutes. So first affirmative constructive, they're going to stand up and read their 8-minute constructive. And then the second negative is going to come up and ask them questions for 3 minutes. So this is also very regimented, I guess. So when it is your turn to answer questions, that's all you're doing is answering questions. That can be really, really hard for your students because a lot of times they will be asked a question that kind of spurs a question for them that they want to ask of the negative team, and they are quick to try to do that. So it's important to practice those CX times because they've got to just answer when it's their time to answer. And it's important when they're supposed to be asking questions that everything is phrased as a question. So new students starting out will also have a tendency to just kind of make statements in cross-ex, and you want to make sure that they're asking questions and not just making those statements. Two things I will say for my students. One, I think it is perfectly fine when they are starting out debate to have this somewhere with them written down that they keep with them in the debate round, because that constructive cross-ex time gets very confusing for new students about when they're supposed to speak next and when they're supposed to ask questions. I don't think there's anything wrong with them having this with them. In fact, I get frustrated sometimes with my freshmen when I say, well, we got confused at whose turn it was. And I'll say, did you keep the piece of paper where I had you write down the speech order? No, we didn't get that out. I really encourage students to have it. I will say what helped me is kind of an easy rule of thumb is you will never stand up to ask questions and then immediately have to give a speech. So you'll see after the first affirmative, it's the second negative that asks questions, because that next person that has to speak is the first negative. So you'll never have to ask questions and then immediately sit down and speak again. You also may notice that the negative team gets to speak back to back. So that's not a typo. So the 2 and C is going to speak, they're going to answer questions, and then their partner, the 1 in R, has the very next speech. Those two speeches together is sometimes referred to as the negative block. So the negative team gets essentially 13 minutes to make arguments before the affirmative team has another opportunity to answer. A lot of times students will say, well, that doesn't seem fair. Why do they get to speak back to back? It exists to create a system where the affirmative speaks first and last. So yes, the negative team gets this 13 minutes. That's a benefit to them. But the trade-off is that now the affirmative team gets to speak first and last, and that's a benefit to them. So debate is about strategy, and it's about having fun, and it's a little bit of a chess match, and that's should be fun and exciting to kids. So it's important that they make sure that they're creating what I would say are positive time trade-offs, not negative time trade-offs. So you want to make sure that you have students kind of strategically trying to predict what arguments do we think that the judge is buying right now, and where do we want to spend most of our time? So if I'm the affirmative team, I need to not only be thinking about what I'm doing in the round, but also I need to be thinking, what do I think is the most persuasive argument that the negative team is making against me right now? Like, what are their biggest winning arguments? And figure out what I think that is so that I can spend more of my time on those things and less of my time on other things. And so that, I think, is the fun part of CX debate, is predicting what you think the other team is thinking and what they're going to do. And at the same time, trying to predict what you think the judge is thinking and what arguments you think the judge is listening to. Okay, so we're going to talk about topicality next. This is my favorite part of policy debate. So the affirmative team has to actually affirm the resolution, right? They can't affirm something different. They can't, the topic is criminal justice reform. Your teams can't say, I don't really want to talk about criminal justice reform. I want to talk about the ocean. They can't do that. They're going to have to talk about whatever the topic is. And when I tell students that, they're like, yeah, that seems easy. And with a really broad example like that, it does seem really easy. Like, sure, it's about criminal justice reform. That's what we're going to talk about. But when you start researching topics and you start seeing debate rounds, you start to realize that every single word in the resolution is important, and they all have different definitions from different people about different ideas. So there's not just one definition of criminal justice reform that exists. When you listen to, I hope you will listen to Dr. Edwards' topic lecture. It's my favorite part of every summer is to listen to Dr. Edwards' topic lecture. He will talk about these things. He will talk about all the different meanings in this year's resolution. And if an affirmative case is talking about something that the negative team does not think is a part of that term, criminal justice reform, then the affirmative team is considered not topical. And if that's true, then the affirmative team loses. So topicality is kind of a neat argument and a dangerous argument at the same time. An affirmative team can quickly lose a debate round if they cannot win that their affirmative case is affirming the actual resolution. I wish I could tell you that topicality is super simple, but it's not. It is a low risk argument for the negative team because while some people are going to disagree, I would say by and large, most people would tell you that if the affirmative team proves that they are topical, that doesn't really mean anything to the negative team because the negative team may have made that argument and also said that their plan doesn't solve. And so the judge may say, well, you know what? I think the AF is topical. I think it's talking about the resolution, but I don't think the plan solves. So I'm still going to vote negative. So it's a pretty low risk argument for negative teams. So I do this thing with my students where I talk to them about like, what would debate look like? Like what would it if we went to tournaments and I just said, you're going to go to this tournament and you're going to debate things. And they just showed up. And then like after they got there and they walked into the round, maybe the judge said, you're debating about this today. Like what would be the negatives to that? And so I let the kids come up with those things and they say like, well, we wouldn't be able to do any research. Well, we wouldn't be able to, and they come up with all these bad things that would result if we just kind of made up topics on the fly. And the great thing is what they really are coming up with are kind of these three important concepts. First, that it's important that we are able to predict what the other people are going to be talking about in a round, because otherwise we couldn't do any research. It's important that the topic provides some sort of limitations, because if I am going to predict and I am going to be able to research, the topic can't be something that just says the United States federal government should make changes to ocean policy. Well, it can't be that, because then what does that mean, right? Like, even though the judge has given me a topic, well, now there's thousands of things that the other team could be talking about. So how can I even then be prepared to debate? And if you think about it too, if it just says the United States federal government should change the ocean policy, so maybe I'm negative and I think, okay, that means I'm going to be defending that the oceans are great the way they are. Well, maybe the affirmative team interpreted the word change in a different direction. So resolutions do an important thing of putting a line here that says these things are affirmative, these things are for the resolution, and these things are negative. That's an important thing that all of those words do for us in the topic. So I kind of show them this. If this is everything in the world that we could debate, the resolution gives us something smaller and something concrete. So what's great is those terms, limits, ground, and predictability. For us in topicality, for my team, that creates what we think are what we call the standards. So those are the reasons that we think our definition is better. We think the way we've defined criminal justice reform is better than their affirmative case because it more fairly limits the topic. It provides clear ground, what's affirmative and what's negative. And it creates a topic and a set of debate arguments that are predictable for everyone. So then the next thing I do with my students is have this conversation with them about, so why do we debate in the first place? Why do we go to tournaments? And they'll say things like, we like to win and we like to have fun, okay? So what if I told you that every single time we went to a debate tournament, anytime you were negative, you were going to lose? Would you still want to go? And they were like, no, that we certainly would not want to go. I'm like, right, because to have fun, you want the debate round to be fair, right? And they say yes. I also want them to want to do debate and go to debate rounds because they learn things. It takes a little bit more prodding to get them to the education part. They like to just stick to because we like to win. So you have to do a lot of, you like to learn things, right? Kind of prod them to that. And so I try to get them to this other piece that you also go to debate rounds because you like to learn and because education is important. And so are you going to learn anything if every single time you go to a debate round, the negative team is going to lose? And they're like, no, it wouldn't learn anything. Okay, so the important things to know about debate is that it matters that you are learning things, and it matters that the debate round is fair. And what they've just done is come up with the impact. We talked about claim, warrant, impact. They've just come up with the impact to their topicality argument. They've come up with that important reason why. So here's what the topicality structure of an argument looks like. It starts with an interpretation of a word, starts with a definition of something. The violation is why the affirmative case is not meeting that definition. I've defined criminal justice reform as this. The affirmative case is not fitting within that definition because. And then our standards typically are limits, ground, and predictability. Those are the three standards that we use most often. And then our voters, most of the time our voters are education and fairness. Those are the two things that I have students focus on the most. You will see, however, these other three frequently. So I wanted to cover them just a little bit. A priori just means at the beginning to take priority. And so it's an argument that says a judge has to evaluate topicality first in a debate round. You'll hear people say it's rule of the game. I think that's similar to fairness, but you'll hear that phrase. And you'll hear the phrase jurisdiction. I think that's similar to fairness as well. It's the argument that the judge doesn't have the jurisdiction to vote on things that are outside of the topic. I put here at the bottom because I think it's important to note I've seen a lot of teams recently combining C and D into kind of one subpoint, I guess. So just don't be alarmed, I guess, when you see that in a debate round. That's something I'm seeing more and more of. So topicality is a negative burden, meaning the judge is going to assume that the affirmative is topical unless the negative team makes an argument that they're not. And a lot of times you'll hear negative teams talk about judge decisions almost as like a Supreme Court role, I guess. You'll hear negative teams say, we can't set this precedent for future debate rounds. We can't allow this affirmative because it has, it would allow all these other affirmatives, and that would be bad for debate. So you hear people kind of talk about topicality in that way. So that's topicality is the negative. Let's switch gears and assume I'm the affirmative. Someone has just ran this topicality argument against me. What do I do? Responses in policy debate are almost always really, really structured. And I encourage my students to number things always because it helps. You'll see a little bit later, it helps take notes in the round too when things are numbered. So the first thing you want an affirmative team to say is, hey, we do meet your interpretation. We fall under that. Let me explain why we can fit under that definition that you've given us. Second thing that an affirmative team can say is, hey, if you don't think that, here's a different definition, though, that we actually think is better. And that's your counter interpretation. I teach my students to do both. Not everyone does. But I teach my students to do both. I don't want them putting all their eggs in one basket. So we're always going to start with both. And then since you have a counter interpretation, same thing, you're going to have counter standards. So for us, those are still limits, ground, and predictability. But we're just explaining why my definition provides better limits than yours, why it provides better ground or better predictability. And then you want to do some voter analysis. We'll talk about what that looks like. So a lot of times, as an affirmative team, I'm going to be making arguments whenever I get to the voters. So we said fairness and education. If I'm the affirmative team, I'm going to be talking in the voters by saying things like, well, this debate is still fair because we haven't done anything to give us an unfair advantage. You'll hear people say the term in-round abuse. We haven't done anything as the affirmative team. The debate round is still fair for you. You'll hear negative teams respond to that and say, but you could in another round, we would call that potential abuse because your affirmative case justifies this bad thing from happening. And when it comes to education, you'll hear a lot of affirmative teams saying, if we're reasonably topical, you should vote affirmative because it's not like they're going to make an argument that says it's not like we're coming to the round. We're supposed to be talking about criminal justice reform, and instead we're talking about ocean policy. We're not doing that. So we're reasonably topical, so you should allow us to debate. And negative teams are going to be saying things like, no, the only way we get education is if we are really serious about how these words are used and that we define them in really specific ways. Let me go back one. I will say that you sometimes will hear people say just topicality is not a voter or topicality should not be a voter. I think that was really popular for a while. I will say I do think I've judged that less and less because I think it's becoming I think it was fun to do for a while. I think it's becoming more and more accepted that it's kind of definitely a necessary part of the debate, but know that your teams may hear things like topicality is not a voter. I would encourage them to continue talking about these things, about fairness and education, that it needs to be a voter because that's how we make sure the debate is fair. All right, hopefully you don't feel like you're taking crazy pills yet, but you might. Hope you're sticking with me. So we talked about affirmative is kind of generating this offense. The affirmative team is talking about these bad things that are happening in the status quo. And we don't want a negative team to just like, man, the status quo is really bad. And I am stuck in the position of just saying like, no, it's not. We don't want negative. So disadvantages are the offense for the negatives. This is a way for them to have some fun arguments. They tell a story, just like a 1AC. They're what we consider off-case arguments. So they're not going to talk about any of those case vocabulary words. So they're not going to talk about inherency, harms or advantages. They're not talking about plain text or solvency. They're this sort of other thing over here. They are longer. So topicality arguments, less than a page. Disadvantages, those are going to take a couple of minutes, 2 to 3 minutes for someone to read. And remember, policy debate is about trying to get to some of those big impacts. So we're going to help the negative team get some of those big impacts. So the structure of a disadvantage, it starts with something called uniqueness. And your teams are going to find evidence for this. They're not writing these arguments themselves. So uniqueness for the negative team is similar to inherency. It's going to argue that there's something in the status quo and things are kind of generally okay. So a uniqueness argument might say something like the United States, well, I guess this is absolutely not true right now, but it might say something like the United States economy is stable and in a positive place. So it's going to be kind of a good thing for the status quo. So I gave you an example. The United States economy is showing signs of improving. I'll talk to you a little bit about why you don't want the uniqueness to be too good. So you don't want probably the uniqueness to say things like, the United States economy is great, it's amazing, and nothing can cause it to decline. You don't want that. You want it to say things like, the United States economy is kind of improving. And so then a link needs to be something that their plan text is doing. So the link needs to be reforming the criminal justice system would cost the federal government millions of dollars. So maybe their plan text, the way that it changes the court systems, or maybe the way that it changes the prison system, maybe the way that it changes those things is something that's going to cost the federal government lots of money. Okay, well, an impact would be like nuclear war leads to extinction. All right, but it's definitely missing some of that stuff that I said earlier, right? We don't want to just go from something to, oh my gosh, nuclear war, everything's terrible. We've got to have some link in the middle. So that link in the middle, we call an internal link. So we don't want to say something's going to cost millions of dollars, everyone's going to die. We want there to be some sort of story, internal link, something in the middle. So, for example, here, the United States economy is showing signs of improving. Reforming the criminal justice system costs the federal government millions. A declining economy causes war with other countries. You're going to want to have evidence that warrants that in some way. So how does a declining economy create war? A lot of times you'll find evidence that says when countries are in economic decline, other countries think that that's kind of prime opportunity to attack a country with a declining economy. So you can find evidence that says those sorts of things. The internal link, this may be more than 4 arguments, depending on how many internal link pieces of evidence you need. So sometimes this may look really more like 2 internal link pieces of evidence or 3 internal link pieces of evidence. I would encourage you, though, if it starts to seem like it's like incredibly confusing to get to the impact, that's maybe a sign it's not working. So I had a debater a few years ago who was sort of notorious for this. He would sit down to write a disadvantage and he'd have like 7 internal links for me to get to the impact. And I would have to say, Drew, it's not a good dissat if it takes you 7 to get there. We need to start over. And so he would, so he'd kind of go back to the drawing board. So if it's taking too many steps to get to that impact, you may want to kind of go back and brainstorm an answer. Okay, so if I'm the affirmative and I am answering a disadvantage, it is important for the affirmative team to still talk about disadvantages and parts. So not to get overwhelmed and just kind of start talking about the disadvantage generally, but that as an affirmative, I'm still saying their uniqueness argument is not true because their link argument is not true because. So here are some examples, if I am an affirmative team, of things that I can say specifically on uniqueness. So that last one is kind of what I was warning you about. Uniqueness overwhelms the brink. So what that means is if the negative team has said the economy is amazing, then the affirmative team can say, well, in that case, the economy is so great the amount of money that our plan costs is not going to affect the economy. So that's kind of that argument. Link responses. So there's no link. It's not a specific enough link to our plan text. Sometimes you can say the 1AC solves that link. So you can say, particularly in this spending money example, a lot of 1ACs will say, it may look like we spend money, but we actually save money in the long run. So the 1AC solves that problem. And then you could make link turn arguments, which are a little bit bigger, and they would say the opposite. So you think we spend money. I actually save money and improve the United States economy, and have reasons why that's true. And then you can talk about the impact. There's no impact to the United States economy being down. It's been low before. Bad things don't happen. And then you could also say impact turn, although these aren't common, because then you have to say things like economic decline is a good thing. That's probably not where you want to go, although those arguments exist, but probably not the place you want to go. So you don't ever want to run a link turn and an impact turn at the same time. I will warn you that for probably my debaters' entire freshman year, I just tell them this and make them promise they won't do it, because it's really hard for them to grasp the why. It's really hard for them to grasp why they can't. But if you think about it, a link turn is saying, I improve the economy. An impact turn is saying, economic decline is a good thing. So now I've contradicted, or kind of more than contradicted myself. I say that to my students sometimes, and I get blank stares, and I just respond with, we're going to talk about this more as we go on in debate. Just promise me you won't do it. And I just kind of make them assure me that they won't run those two arguments together. Yeah, that's description. Okay, so flowing is up next. I'm also a really weird nerd when it comes to what we call flowing debate. What we mean when we say that is that it is the technique that we use to take notes in a debate round. This is the way that I flow now. This is not actually the way that I was taught to flow by my coach, but it's the way that I flow now, and it's the way I teach my students to flow, because debate certainly has changed. I encourage my students to flow on blank printer paper and lots of it. I think that students have a hard time with because you'll see why, but with the lines, if they just write where the lines are on lined paper, they're going to run out of room. If they try to start squishing multiple lines in the spaces, then they can't read what they wrote. I've had a couple of different teams prefer to use not white paper. So the only reason is it stands out a little more if you're using, it still needs to be a light color, but if they were using like light blue, they could quickly find their flows and didn't get mixed up with anyone else's things. If your team, I think most people probably are on computers now, but if your team also has evidence on paper, it keeps your flows distinguished from the white paper that your evidence and things are on. And I encourage students to flow with 2 different colors of pen. So I encourage students to flow everything that their team says in one color and everything that the other team says in a different color. That helps them so that when they have their flows at the podium to give a speech, they can quickly see this was my argument and this was their argument, because you would be surprised at how quickly you can get confused, especially if it's the 3rd or the 4th round of the day and you've been aff and neg already once, and it can get quickly confused. Some of my students like to use highlighters. I never did. It drove me crazy, but a few of my students have liked to especially when they get to the rebuttals, the end of the debates, to highlight the arguments that they really want to talk about and really want to touch on. I have also had students tell me they just weren't going to flow and that they didn't need to flow. And that makes me want to pull my hair out, because they need to flow. They need to take notes in the debate round, because it's the only way that they have a record of who has said what in rounds. I promise you, I have a kid who resisted flowing until district of his junior year. And he was not super successful until district of his junior year. And he walked out of debate rounds and said, "Hey, Ms. Cornish, I finally started flowing, and I see why that's really important now." I was like, oh, it only took 3 years. So there's just only so much that you can remember of what has happened in the debate round. Also helps you in prep time. You remember what they've said, what the other team has said. You kind of know what arguments you're trying to make. When I say be a team player, because you can't, like a lot of times this student, he would say, "Oh, I did make that argument." And his partner was like, "No, you didn't." Because you can't take notes and speak at the same time. So when you're giving a speech, it's important that your partner records what you actually said, because you may have an idea of what you think you said, but you may have missed something. And it's important that your partner can tell you what those misses were. And it keeps the debate organized. It's the same reason that I'm using a PowerPoint presentation to talk to you about policy debate, because if I just sat down to talk to you about this, I would be all over the place talking about topicality, and then I'd move to disadvantages, and I forgot something about topicality. It keeps you organized. And then, at some point I tell them, you flow because I said so, and I'm really tired of having this argument with you about flowing. Pre-flowing, I think, is incredibly important, especially if you are affirmative. You know what your 1AC is going to be before you go in. You're giving the first speech. So before you walk in there, go ahead and have that done, and try not to delay rounds. A lot of judges, I'll be honest, I'm one of them. So if your students see me anywhere in the back of the room, I'm one of them that is very annoyed when teams walk in and say, "Can we just have a few minutes to pre-flow?" Because I think, why did you not do that? It is time for the round to start. I don't want to delay the tournament. So I have students turn their paper portrait style, and I have them think about columns. Sometimes they draw them out, and that's fine. Each speech that happens is a column. So the 1AC happens in one column, the 1NC happens next to it, so that they can go ahead and draw those columns out, because they know how many speeches are going to happen in the round. They do need to write small. I know a lot of our students write really, really big, but there are going to be a lot of arguments they've got to get in a small space. So they do need to write small, and they probably don't need to write in cursive. I only wrote in cursive whenever I learned how to flow, and I had to stop. They probably need to write in as block of a print as they can. Talk to them about shorthand. Talk to them about general note-taking skills. Our students don't know that when they come to us. They don't know that they don't have to write every article. They don't know that they don't have to write United States federal government. They don't know that. So talk to them about shorthand and coming up with whatever shorthand works for them. Debaters will read a tag. They'll read something at the beginning of a piece of evidence that says what that evidence is about. That's really what they need to write down. They don't then need to write down every single word in that evidence. They'll get overwhelmed if they try to. This is very hard to explain virtually, but when they get to the end of the page, they need to grab the page at the bottom and turn it over to write on the back instead of turning it over the other way. If you have a piece of paper, if you do it both ways, you'll see that if you turn it like a normal page, now your columns are on opposite sides. You want to flip from the bottom up so that your columns stay together. And they should use a lot of paper. So topicality should be on a piece of paper. Each disadvantage should be on a piece of paper. We take whole reams of paper to tournaments. These are some of my flows from who knows what, honestly. So I don't really know what, I don't remember when I found these, what kind of a debate round I was flowing, but you can see I have kind of a column here and I've written in green. And then the next speech happened and I wrote something else. It kind of used multiple pieces of paper. I label up here what that piece of paper is. So like this piece of paper is solvency, and I just put an S at the top. A different piece of paper might have topicality or disad or something like that. And you see I use lots of shorthand and just no signs and that kind of thing. I do a weird thing that I learned one year at camp when I was in high school. I write without any vowels. So here's a good argument at the bottom that says reject. It's just the word reject without any vowels. That drives some people crazy. So they don't have to do it that way, but that just helped me write faster. And you can see, like, after all these years, I mean, I still kind of mess up. Like, that's very squished together. I would not recommend the columns be that close together, but they are. So you want flows to have neat columns. You want it to have lots of space. Use arrows and things when you can. And the debate will get smaller and smaller. So you'll be using, if you're using a whole piece of paper, you'll use less and less of it because rebuttals are getting, remember those rebuttals are only 5 minutes. Flowing is hard. I always tell my students, I wish I had a magic wand, but I don't. And the only way they get better at flowing is just doing it over and over and over again. So we watch lots of practice debates and flow. I have them flow songs. We listen to different songs and they flow. So just finding different ways for them to just start learning shorthand, learning how to write quickly, things like that. Okay, the cross-examination period is something I want to talk about next. So that's that piece where you're either answering questions or asking questions. So after each constructive, it is very, very important that students find a balance between being assertive and also being polite. Particularly new students have a tendency to lean one way or another depending on who they are. So some of your students that are maybe a little shy or quiet, they may tend to get intimidated by people asking them so many questions. So you want to teach them to make sure that they are assertive and speak up. And at the same time, you don't want anyone to be mean to each other. Remember, it's a civilized argument. It's only 3 minutes. Now, there is this weird thing. I say weird. I mean, it is kind of odd in debate. When we do the cross-ex period, you're going to stand next to the other person, but you are both going to face forward. So they're not going to turn and face each other. That's for a number of reasons. I think the most important thing to tell students is because you at all times are trying to win the judge's ballot. So I don't care if I convince the other team, that doesn't matter. So why am I going to look at the other team during cross-ex? I'm going to look at the judge because that's the person I care most about. Cross-ex is important. I wouldn't say that I know that I've never thought someone won or lost a round based on what was happening in the CX period. So it's important, but it's also important for your students to know when they sit down, like, I promise they didn't just lose the debate round no matter what happened in that cross-ex time. Assuming they didn't break the rules in the cross-ex time, then they didn't lose. So it is important to know that you are still, if you've just given a speech, the first affirmative constructive, the person from the other team is asking you questions, but you still hold the floor. So your partner does not get to have the floor. and answer questions on your behalf. Just like the other team, their partner is not also going to get the floor and both get to ask you questions. So you're on your own when you're answering questions. Your partner can't help you out. And when you're asking questions, you're on your own. So that's important to know. I remember being very intimidated by that, having to answer questions all on my own. But it's also very important for your kids to get to that point where they can do that. You want to try to teach kids to ask open-ended questions, not to try to avoid yes or no questions. And they can ask clarifying questions. So when they were taking notes, they didn't hear all of a disadvantage. That's the time for them to say, hey, I didn't hear what that disadvantage was. Can you explain it to me? So we don't ever want kids to come out of a round and say, well, it didn't go well because I didn't understand the argument. We want to make sure that they use that time to ask all of the questions that they need to ask until they do understand the argument. You really, really want to be nice. Sometimes you do have to interrupt people though, because you don't want them to dominate an entire 3 minutes. So you do want to, try to teach your students to make sure they're assertive and at some point interrupt, but interrupt in a way that's polite and not going to be rude. Yeah, take a deep breath in CX. It really is going to be okay, but you want to think about some of those things and think about some of the strategies. So when they are asking a question, try to predict where that question is going and why are they asking that question so that you answer in a way that keeps you out of a corner and you answer in a way that keeps you ahead in the debate round. And you want to know the answers, especially if they're asking you about an argument you made. So if you're the first affirmative constructive and you read that case, you want to make sure that you know what your plan is, what it does, how it's going to fix the problem. You want to know all of those answers. I used to make my first affirmative speakers, haven't done it in a long time, but I used to make them stand at the front of the room and everyone in class got to cycle through and ask questions about that affirmative case until nobody could think of any more, however long that took, and make that person stand up there and answer all those questions. Make sure you listen to what the question is asking. CX debaters could be great politicians because you'll get really good at answering a different question, not the one that was really asked, that kind of thing. So those are cool skills that the kids will learn. Remember that they shouldn't be making statements when they're supposed to be asking questions. You want to make sure that they're actually asking questions and that the questions are short enough for people to understand. Sometimes I'll listen to kids kind of go on and on and on and on and on in this question, and then the other person will have to say, I'm sorry, what were you asking? You want it to be short enough that they understand the question. So when we're talking about these impacts, these advantages and disadvantages, there are kind of three ways that we weigh the affirmative case against the disadvantages that we've said are happening. And I ask my students to talk about that using three words: magnitude, probability, and time frame. How big is the impact of your affirmative? Or how big is the impact of your disadvantage? How likely is the impact of your disadvantage going to happen? And how soon is it going to happen? So is your disadvantage highly likely and a big magnitude, but it's not going to happen for 30 years? Well, then maybe we should risk the affirmative. So those are sorts of rebuttal type arguments now where we're comparing. So we've read these advantages, we've read this disadvantages. Now how do we compare those two? Now how do we argue those two against each other? So if the risk of the advantage is greater than the risk of the disadvantage, then that's going to go to the affirmative. But if the reverse is true, then the judge is going to vote for the negative team for that particular argument. So theoretically, what we're doing is like imagining a world where these things are happening. So what the judge is deciding on is you're kind of imagining a world where, okay, the plan happens, it then creates this disadvantage. Now, what effect does that have? And what's the result of that? So you want to refer, like I said, this is the rebuttals kind of that we're talking about. You want to refer to evidence that's already been read. You don't want to read new evidence, make new arguments, those sorts of things. I want to cover counter plans briefly. I went back and forth for a long time about whether or not to include this, and I decided I'm seeing them so often now. I did want to at least cover it. So what a counter plan does is gives another option for the negative team, because if the negative team is supposed to advocate just the status quo, sometimes that can be bad. Like sometimes the negative team's like, I don't really like the status quo. Maybe the status quo is bad. I don't want to talk about it. And so what they'll do is run a counter plan. So they're going to say, we think that maybe the status quo is not great, but we don't think that your plan is good, and that's not how you solve for the problems that exist. So you do this when you think the status quo maybe is not a good option. The analogy that was given to me whenever I first started learning counter plans was if you were to have a flat tire. If you have a flat tire that's bad, you don't want to argue the status quo, because you don't want to be like, having a flat tire was really a neat thing. You don't want to be stuck having to make that argument. But there are multiple options for what you do next if you have a flat tire, right? You can change it yourself. You can call someone you know to change it. You can call AAA to come help you. You have options of things that you can do. And so that's what we are giving the negative team. What they need to be able to do this is a counterplan text, just like the affirmative. It needs to be different than the affirmatives, but it's the same structure. Just like the affirmative, they need to be able to prove that their plan text works. And the advantage is you actually already know what that is. The negative team is going to call them disadvantages, like we talked about earlier, right? But the negative team is going to be saying, your plan solves the problem, but causes this bad disadvantage to happen. My plan solves the problem, but doesn't cause that bad disadvantage to happen. So that makes my plan better than yours. So some rules of counter plans, they need to be what we would call mutually exclusive, meaning you can't be able to do the plan and the counter plan at the same time. Otherwise, there's no clash in the debate round, right? If the affirmative plan is like, we're going to reform the court system, and the negative plan is like, hey, we're going to reform jails, like you can do both of those things. So those aren't clashing with each other. So they need to be mutually exclusive. They need to be what we would call competitive. So the negative team can't just say like, hey, here's another option. It's got to say, here's another option, and there is a net benefit to doing my other option. So what I tell my teams is, in baseball, the rule is the tie goes to the runner. In the world, the tie goes to the affirmative. So if the AF reads a plan and you read a plan and there's no reason that yours is any better, the affirmative is going to win. So you need to have some reason why your counter plan is better. Some people will tell you that counter plans have to be not topical. That is I don't want to say judge preference. It's more than that. That's a theory that judges have and some judges don't. I think that's an important question. If your teams want to run a counter plan before the debate round, they ask the judge how they feel about topical and non-topical counter plans. Because some judges will say your counter plan needs to not be talking about the resolution, and others have a different idea. That's kind of what we've discussed. So now if I'm affirmative, someone has ran a counter plan against me, I need to figure out what to do. The first thing I am always going to do is something called a permutation, or PERM for short. That says that we're going to test and see if we can do the the affirmative plan and the counter plan at the same time. Because remember, they have to be mutually exclusive. So we're going to say they can be done at the same time. That means the counter plan should lose. That's the first argument we're going to make. You can make offensive arguments about the counter plan would create bad things to happen. You can make solvency arguments that say the counter plan doesn't solve for the harms that the affirmative team presented. And you could run theory arguments, maybe that say counter plans are bad for some reason or another. But the counter plan, I should say, has to make an attempt to solve the harms of the 1AC. So the 1AC can't be talking about problems in court systems and the negative team just stand up and say, we want to talk about problems in the jails. Like, you can't talk about something different. You have to make an attempt to solve the 1AC arguments. This is I guess my advice almost to new coaches. Debate can sometimes get really frustrating for students early on because they don't understand the judge's decisions. And it's not like a sporting event. There's not a scoreboard. I kind of wish there was, but there's not a scoreboard in debate rounds where you know who's ahead all the time. I don't ever let my students say the judge made a wrong decision. That is not a phrase that we can say on my team. And we do not talk about judges being wrong. We don't talk about judges being bad either. They are who they are at the back of the room. And if you lost the round, we need to figure out how we win the round in front of that judge the next time. I think that's important because I promise your debaters will be happier debaters when they get to this point. Because think how frustrating that has to be for them to think, I keep going into this round and that bad judge keeps making that wrong decision, and why do I keep going in front of that judge? So it helps really them to take control, because now they have the control to say, no matter who's at the back of the room, no matter what how they judge, I'm going to figure out how to win that ballot. There are different types of judges, and it's okay for your students to ask judges before debate rounds what their judge paradigm is. Sometimes they will give you an answer that looks like this. They'll tell you, I am a stock issues judge, or I'm a policymaker judge, or I am a tabula rasa judge. Other judges will just kind of talk to you about arguments. That's me. I don't know where I fit in these three categories, so I don't like to give them a name. I try to just answer questions about how I view debate and how I view arguments. But it's okay for your students to ask before the round. And if they don't understand, if the judge says, I'm a tab judge, and the team doesn't know what that means, perfectly acceptable for them to say, can you tell me what that means? I think that's okay for teams to do. Okay, I made it at 12:28. I covered a lot of material, I know, but I hope at least some of it stuck.
Thank you, Nicole. That was amazing, because it is a lot of theory that has to be covered. And I know that everyone very much appreciated your slideshow and your details that you gave us. There are a few questions in chat. One in particular is about flowing. And the question is, do you suggest flowing off case on one side of the paper and on case on the other side of the paper?
No, I would suggest off case on its own paper and on case on its own paper. One, because you may run out of room and you may need to use both sides of the paper, but also I think it keeps students more organized and keeps them from accidentally flowing on the wrong side.
Okay, another question here has to do with files. Let me see if this makes sense to you. The question is, are you able to use files in the debate round if you need to quickly look for something?
Yeah, so I think maybe an important thing to know, I guess, about policy debate is that when students, because we know the topic ahead of time, because it's predictable, students should go into the round with lots and lots of research, and they should use that research, read pieces of evidence in the round, and the more rounds,